Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. In the last video I managed to get this drive gear bracket and the swivel support bracket assembled for the K&T universal milling head. And this week my goal is to get the universal swivel and the milling head assembled and installed. The guts here of the universal swivel essentially take the power that's coming out of the horizontal spindle of the machine and turn it 90 degrees, and also allowing the whole swivel to rotate around that horizontal axis. Did manage to find a couple of new bearings here for the bevel drive gear, and we'll get those installed once I get these parts here laid out so I can make sure that I have everything in front of me that I'm going to need to put this thing together. The guts of everything center around this drive gear support stud. The first thing that needs to go on is this short little spacer. The next piece to go on is this bevel drive gear, but I need to go ahead and get the new bearings placed in first. There's a bearing on either end of this drive gear, and they have the same OD, but they have different IDs. So the bearing with the larger ID goes on the bottom, and the one with the smaller goes on the top. I'm going to pack them here with grease as best I can before I install them in the bevel gear. I want to make sure that the back of them is plenty full of grease. I've got another new bearing here for the top, and this one's a little different than the original. The original has a shield on one side of the bearing. Same thing with the one that goes on the bottom. But this one has, it's not a full seal that's on the new bearing. It's just a partial shield. But I don't think that's really going to be a major issue. But I do want to get it full of grease. That shield does make it a little bit more difficult to get it packed full of grease, so I'm just going to use a technique that I use when I'm packing wheel bearings for a car, and that is to just put a big glob of it in my hand and then push the bearing down onto that big blob of grease, and that pushes it up through the gap and into the bearing spaces. Well, these are ready to go in, but I want to make sure I put the bottom bearing in the bottom here. There's actually an indicator on the side of the bevel drive gear to show you which one is the top. This one is the bottom one, which is the smaller one. I'll get it started here with a brass hammer, and then I'll use the old bearing to drive it the rest of the way until it's seated. With the bearings in place now, I'll slide it over the support stud, and in the very end of the support stud there is a groove for a circlip. With that support stud now all assembled, I can get it into the universal swivel. First I have to put this big woodruff key in the end of the shaft. This mates up with the keyway that's in the casting. I can get this started easy enough by hand. You can see it starting to come out the other side and make sure that key is lined up with the keyway, but I'm going to have to use a little bit of impact force to get it to seat the rest of the way. The support stud gets fastened in place using this big 1.5 inch 12 nut. Now, this thing got a little bit disfigured when I was taking this apart because I did not have and still do not have a wrench large enough to fit this or a socket large enough, and even if I did, it probably wouldn't fit on it anyway because of the way that the casting is so closely tight to where this nut fits that I have to resort to using some channel locks. I was a little more careful putting this on than when I was taking it off. There are still some scars from my stupidity when removing this, but I'm trying real hard not to add any more. Finish off the universal swivel here by installing a grease fitting on the end of the support stud. Well, the next thing I can do now is install that universal swivel onto the swivel support bracket. Swivel is held onto the support bracket with 4 T-bolts, and these are easy enough to install through this slot that I can get to through one of the holes for the overarm supports. Well, now the trick is I need to get these 4 bolts sort of spaced about where they need to be in the swivel so that as I set it down on top of the support bracket, they'll go into the mounting holes on the swivel. I do want to put a little bit of grease here on the inside and on the face of the swivel just to hopefully make assembly a little bit smoother. Well, now let's see if I can get lucky enough to slide this thing over the drive shaft and into those 4 T-bolts. Now, one thing I have to be really careful of is as I'm placing this thing down, that drive shaft rides on some needle bearings that are up inside this swivel. I did not remove those needle bearings. I left them in place, and they're held in there with a little bit of grease right now, but there's not a whole lot else that's holding them in, and my concern here is if I get this thing a little bit too off kilter that I could end up losing some of those needle bearings, and we'll have to take this thing back all apart again in order to fix that. Right now they're being obstructed by that stud support that we just installed, so I need to be careful of what I'm doing here and make sure I don't screw those up.
There we go. Maybe.
Wow, okay, well that was a bit of a pain, but I'm happy that it's on, and of course I just moved the swivel And the T-bolt that's back there just fell back through the slot and down inside the support bracket. So I've got to reach up underneath here and push that T-bolt back up, get it back in the slot, and try to get a washer and a nut on it before I make the same stupid mistake again.
So that's there. Okay. There we go.
Oops, I did it again.
Did it again. Let's not do that anymore.
Well, the last thing that goes on is this plug that fills in the hole where the drive shaft's at. There is a screw that goes into this threaded hole in the center. I can't find it at the moment, but I will find something and put it in there before I load this thing up with grease. Well, that's it for the universal swivel, and that was a fairly simple component, not a whole lot to it, outside of getting the studs aligned and not dropping them back through the mounting hole. This was pretty simple. All the grease zerks are installed and ready to take grease. I won't do that just yet. Well, with the swivel installed now, I can get to the milling head itself. And not a whole lot to this piece. You know, it's just the spindle with some bearings. I do have the grease zerks already installed, so it's just now a matter of installing the guts into it. The parts diagram is pretty clear on this one as well. There's a couple of bearings that we'll talk about when we get there, but I was able to locate a new bearing race for the main spindle bearing. You might recall that the original bearing race had really bad rust pitting on it, and it was totally junk and useless. Fortunately, I was able to get it out and locate a Timken replacement. Well, next I can start assembling the spindle itself. Now, the spindle bearing here I was not able to do anything with. It does have some rust on some of the rollers, but unfortunately there is no way for me to replace this. Well, maybe you can tell from this backup spindle why I can't replace those bearings. You can see here that the inner race for those bearings is actually machined into the spindle itself. It is an integral part of the spindle. It doesn't come off. The factory, the way I understand it, the rollers were placed into the inner race here, and then a cage, an unbent cage, was placed around those rollers, and then they used some special tool to crimp all that together, and that's what creates the spindle bearing. So then you might think, why don't I just machine off this piece of the spindle where the inner race is and just replace it with an off-the-shelf spindle? The problem is the thickness of the spindle wall. This is a 40 taper spindle, and if I were to machine off the rest of that and make this, parallel sides, I don't know if I'd have much wall thickness left. Who knows, I might actually end up machining into the taper and I wouldn't have a spindle left. So as it is, I'm kind of stuck with what I have. Now there might be some other ways I could have handled these spindle bearings, maybe cut the cage off and replace the rollers and then weld the cage back on, and that's something that I won't rule out I'll never do. But I think for now, I'm just going to put some oil in here, go ahead and assemble this thing, and once I get it running, I can judge whether or not I feel like any additional modifications or changes are going to be necessary. Well, as I insert the spindle here in the casting, the first thing that goes on is this collar or this spacer that goes over top of the spindle, and then a bevel gear goes in next. Well, almost. Before I can put the bevel gear on, there's a bearing spacer that actually goes above the bevel gear, and I have to kind of insert that first into the casting before the bevel gear can go in, because I can't put it in after the bevel gear is in place. So I'm sitting here looking at this thing, and something doesn't seem to look right. It feels okay, but something doesn't seem to look right. That bearing spacer seems to be sticking up awful far. The bearing actually won't fit down into the race appropriately. So I made a mistake here that I actually didn't catch until after it was completely assembled. What I thought here was that the parts diagram was somehow wrong, and that spacer was in there backwards, and I needed to switch it around. This spacer back out when it was in the correct way, and I ended up flipping it around, which was totally wrong. The interesting thing is it still fits. It fit in there just fine, and which makes sense. What I didn't realize before I switched this thing around is that the bevel gear hadn't actually fully seated onto the splines of the spindle, and that was causing that bearing race to be a little elevated. Had I paid attention, I would have noticed that. And I ended up noticing it, but like I said, not until everything was fully assembled. So we're going to pretend that I fixed that, because everything else from this point forward is correct. But like I said, at some point I got to take this thing back apart. Now, besides the spindle bearing, this tapered bearing here on the top is the only other bearing I did not replace. This is a super special bearing, probably made only for Kearney and Trecker, and it had these little slots in the side, and that's what makes it special. I did locate one, but it was $1,200, so I opted to just reuse the one I had. It seemed fine. There's no problems with this particular bearing, so I don't see any issues with being able to use this in the machine. So I do have this little special wedged key that fits down inside that tapered slot. I presume this is here to keep the bearing from spinning on the shaft. This is similar to the bearings that were in the table crank, the X-axis crank. Also had bearings like this with a little special slot in them. With the bearing in place, I can install this nut which sets the preload on the bearing. To tighten this nut, I'm going to use this spanner wrench. I also have an old brass punch jammed in the bevel gear here to keep it from spinning. Well, I have that nut tight, but the bearing just doesn't sound right. It's making some noise, and it still hasn't dawned on me yet that I have that bearing spacer in backwards, and I'm thinking that it's something else. I don't see the rollers turning as I'm turning the spindle, so I know something's not right. I haven't quite figured out what it is yet, but I'm going to go ahead and take this thing back apart so I can take a closer look at that bearing. Well, past me still hasn't figured out what future me knows, and that is the bearing spacer is in backwards. So I'm thinking that there's something wrong with the bearing because I'm not seeing the rollers spin when I turn the spindle. I'll take this over to the parts washer and give it a clean, put some brake cleaner in just to make sure that there's no junk down inside there. But I'm, trying to rule out that there's an issue with the bearing because, like I said, I still haven't quite figured out that spacer is in the wrong way. Well, this is where I started to realize that there was something wrong. I tried to put a little more preload on those bearings and everything bound up. The spindle wouldn't turn. It still hasn't dawned on me yet that spacer's in backwards, but I am starting to think that there's something a little bit wackadoodle here that I haven't quite figured out. So the only thing I really did was loosen that nut. I still went further and put this thing more together. I still haven't figured out that I've got that spacer in there wrong, but forging ahead is what I do. Well, and again, if I continue to pretend that everything is okay, because I still haven't figured out that it's not, the next thing to go on here is the bearing cap. Well, not really, but I'll figure that out here in a second. And I have a Zerk fitting here that goes into the bearing cap so I can lubricate this upper bearing. I am still on the fence as to whether or not this should be oil or grease. Spindle bearings are generally oiled and not greased, so I'm still a little bit baffled as to how the oil stays up inside this thing. And this is when I realized that the set screws that are supposed to be in the spindle nut are still sitting on the bench, and I never installed them. So I'm taking the bearing cap back off so I can then install those set screws. I still haven't figured out I got that spacer in backwards. There are two set screws in this nut that are 90 degrees apart, and they just keep the nut from backing off of the spindle. And as I go to put this bearing cap back on, I realize I made another mistake. There's supposed to be a felt washer that goes inside the groove at the top of this bearing cap. There was one in there when I disassembled it, and I forgot about it until just now, so I need to make one. I have a piece of felt left over from when I was assembling the table on the K&T and the saddle. I think I used these for the large felt plugs that go underneath the table. I'll go ahead and use an old hole punch that I made a long time ago to at least punch out the majority of the center, and then I can go ahead and trim up the inside and the outside with just a pair of scissors and a razor blade. It's a little bit oversized, but that's fine. Actually, probably a good thing. I'll go ahead and soak it in some of the spindle oil I plan on using, which is just Mobile DTE heavy medium. Same stuff that goes in the knee and the transmission of the 2HL, so I think this will suffice for bearing lubrication as well. I can get that bearing cap reinstalled and forcing that felt washer into that groove a little bit deeper so I can get it around the back of the spindle. Now at the mouth of the spindle, there's this brass or bronze ring that goes around the spindle between it and the casting. Now, the parts diagram calls this a grease retainer ring, which is why I am given pause, or at least another reason why I'm given pause as to whether or not I should be putting oil in this thing or grease. If it was oil, why would they call it a grease retainer ring and not an oil retaining ring? Now the retaining ring is held in place with a couple of set screws that are 180 degrees apart from each other. You can tell here in this broken part of the casting that somebody didn't know that that's what those were for when this thing was disassembled at some time in its past. It's obvious this thing has been crashed or gone through, and there have been other repairs that were made to it, but I'm assuming that somebody did not know that that ring was held in place with those set screws, and when they tried to hammer the spindle out from the other end, the spindle was taking that brass ring with it, and with the set screws in place, it ended up shattering the casting. At least that's my speculation anyway. Well, with the milling head now all together, the next step is to go ahead and get it installed onto the universal swivel. So we'll tilt this all over on its back and make this a little bit easier to install. In order to install the head onto the swivel, I need to get these T-bolts into the swivel, and they don't go in from the front.
I think I should have put those in first.
So I guess I really wasn't paying attention. And I am going to need to pull the swivel back off of the support bracket so I can get these T-bolts installed properly. Well, with that swivel now off of the support bracket, I can get these T-bolts installed going up through the center. There's a little notch in the lower bottom. The thing is, I should have known this because I was watching the video of how I took this thing apart, and I remember struggling with how to get these T-bolts out. And for whatever reason, it didn't dawn on me that I needed to put them in here before I installed it onto the swivel. But, oh well, no harm, no foul. Well, now I got to get the swivel back onto the support bracket, and it was a bit of a struggle doing this the first time. So I'm hoping the second time goes a little bit easier at least.
Are you kidding? First try? Holy shit.
Seriously, what the fuck are you doing?
How many times am I going to do this before I learn? Stop doing that.
Well, now with those studs installed, I can put this thing back on its back and try to line up these studs to where that they'll mate up with the mounting holes in the milling head. Before we try to install the head, I want to make sure there's an ample amount of grease here on the bevel gear coming out of the swivel. Put the head now on the mounting bolts. I can install the washers and the nuts. Well, I have the head rotated around here so I can see it, and I'm manually spinning the driven gear here in the support bracket and seeing that the spindle is rotating in the head. So everything seems to be functioning fine. It's not binding up anywhere, at least not at this point. So I'm pretty happy that this is coming back together. Now, I still haven't figured out that that spacer's in backwards, but I will. Just haven't yet. I've left these off until now just so they wouldn't be in the way, but these are the clamps that hold the drive gear housing onto the machine base securely. Now the parts diagram calls these gibs. I always thought a gib was something a little bit different than this, but regardless, these just get held on with a couple of bolts. Now there's a couple of studs that go into the swivel support bracket. Now these are used to tighten it down onto the overarms. Now these studs are threading into the casting that have the cracks in it. I'm hoping that these won't be a problem. I'll still be able to use this without having to get these brazed up, but I'm pretty positive I'm going to need to deal with that probably sooner than later. But for now, we'll just use some blue Loctite to keep them from easily backing out, and hopefully we'll still be able to use this and those cracks won't propagate any further than they are until I can get them repaired. And this piece here is the support stud for the parking attachment. The crane hooks up underneath this ball and makes it easy to take this attachment off of the overarms and then to swing it around to the parking attachment. Well, that's it. This thing is now completely back together. Well, almost. A little while after shooting this video, I went back out in the shop, probably around midnight, because it was bugging me that that bearing just didn't feel right. I studied my uninstall videos, disassembly videos, and looked at the parts diagram, and sure enough, I realized that spacer was in there backwards. So I came back out and took this head back apart and was able to get that spacer oriented correctly and got it back together, and I'm happy where it's at now. So we did fix it. The next step for this thing is to finish machining this drive gear that my friend Cooper made for me. I'm very, very, very appreciative that he did this for me. It was an experiment for him too. He's learning how to make these on his Bridgeport. And I have this 40 taper blank that I think I'm going to use for the arbor for it. So I still have to figure out exactly how I'm going to machine this thing. So it might be a little bit while before I get back to this part. Well, I think I'm going to end this video here. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below. Those things really help with the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe if you're not a subscriber. You can hit that bell icon. You'll know when the next video drops. I really do appreciate all of the support that I've been given through PayPal and through other means. It really, really does mean a lot. Without that support, I wouldn't be able to get some of these projects done. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.